Most empaths have been carrying abilities their entire lives that they were never supposed to carry alone. They feel things no one asked them to feel, see things no one taught them to see, and know things they have no logical reason to know. And instead of being guided toward understanding these capacities, they were told they were too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too intense. The world handed them a gift wrapped in suffering and then blamed them for bleeding. Carl Jung spent his career working with patients who described experiences that would get them dismissed by almost any other clinician. They talked about sensing things in rooms before anyone spoke, about knowing someone's intentions before those intentions were ever acted upon, about feeling the weight of emotions that didn't belong to them, as though their body was a sponge for every unspoken grief within a mile radius. Most psychiatrists heard these descriptions and reached for a diagnosis. Jung reached for a notebook because he recognized something in these patients that fascinated him. They weren't delusional. They were perceiving real phenomena through psychological channels that most human beings had either never developed or had shut down entirely. But here's what Jung also discovered, and this is the part that will unsettle you. These abilities weren't purely gifts. They were adaptations. They emerged from specific psychological conditions, and they came with a cost that almost no one was willing to name. The spiritual community celebrated empathic abilities as evidence of higher consciousness. Jung saw them as something far more complex, something that was simultaneously a profound capacity and a deep wound operating through the same mechanism. Today I'm going to reveal what Jung actually understood about empathic abilities, the hidden origin most empaths have never been told, why these abilities malfunction in ways that destroy the person carrying them, and the psychological truth that transforms empathic sensitivity from a burden you can barely survive into a power you can actually wield. Jung's research into empathic abilities didn't begin with anything mystical. It began with a clinical observation so simple that his colleagues overlooked it entirely. He noticed that certain patients consistently demonstrated accurate knowledge about other people's psychological states without any conventional means of obtaining that knowledge. A patient would describe her husband's internal conflict with precision. That matched what emerged months later in the husband's own therapy. Another would walk into a group setting and immediately identify the person in the room carrying the most psychological distress, even when that person was performing happiness convincingly enough to fool everyone else present. Jung tracked these observations for years, and the pattern that emerged challenged everything the psychiatric establishment believed about human perception. These patients weren't guessing. They weren't reading body language in any conscious way. They were accessing information through what Jung came to understand as the collective unconscious, a shared psychological field connecting all human psyches beneath the surface of individual awareness. Empaths, in Jung's framework, had unusually thin barriers between their individual consciousness and this collective field. They were picking up signal that most people's psyches filtered out automatically. But Jung refused to romanticize this, because the same patients who demonstrated extraordinary perceptual abilities were also the ones most likely to be psychologically devastated. They came to him exhausted, confused, unable to distinguish their own emotions from the emotional noise surrounding them. Their gift and their suffering shared a single root system, and you couldn't address one without understanding the other. The hidden truth Jung uncovered was this: empathic abilities almost always develop as survival responses in childhood environments, where the child's safety depends on reading the unspoken. The daughter whose mother's mood could shift from warmth to violence without warning learned to detect emotional weather patterns the way a sailor learns to read the sky. Not because she was spiritually gifted, because her nervous system determined that perceiving emotional shifts before they became dangerous was the only way to stay safe. Her ability wasn't born from enlightenment. It was born from threat. This doesn't diminish the ability. Jung was clear about that. The capacity is real, regardless of its origin. But the origin matters enormously because it determines how the ability functions. An ability born from threat operates through a threat detection framework. It's always scanning for danger, always monitoring for shifts, always bracing for the emotional explosion it was designed to predict. The empath doesn't just perceive others' emotional states. They perceive them through a filter of survival anxiety that distorts the information and exhausts the perceiver. This is why empaths are perpetually drained, not because feeling deeply is inherently exhausting, but because their perceptual system is running a survival program 24 hours a day. They're not just sensing emotions. They're scanning for threats disguised as emotions. Every interaction becomes an unconscious threat assessment. Every room they enter triggers a full environmental scan. Their nervous system never rests, because the child who developed this ability couldn't afford to let it rest. And that child's programming is still running the show decades later. Jung identified this as the critical distinction between raw empathic ability and what he called conscious empathic perception. Raw ability operates automatically, indiscriminately, and at enormous personal cost. It absorbs everything because the survival program doesn't know how to be selective. It can't distinguish between a genuine threat and someone simply having a bad day. It treats all emotional information as potentially dangerous because the environment where it developed made that assumption necessary. Conscious empathic perception, by contrast, operates through choice. The empath perceives the same information, but processes it through an integrated psyche rather than a traumatized one. They can sense someone's grief without drowning in it. They can detect dishonesty without spiraling into hypervigilance. They can read a room without their nervous system treating every emotional signal as a 5-alarm fire. The information comes in. They observe it. They decide what to do with it. The ability serves them instead of consuming them. But getting from raw ability to conscious perception requires something most empaths resist with everything they have. It requires confronting the wound that created the ability in the first place. It requires looking at the childhood environment that made this level of perceptual sensitivity necessary and grieving the fact that you should never have needed it. It requires acknowledging that your spiritual gift has a trauma signature embedded in its operating system, and that acknowledgement feels like it diminishes the gift, which is why empaths avoid it. Jung found that empaths clung to the spiritual narrative of their abilities precisely because it allowed them to avoid the psychological truth. Calling yourself an empath who was born with a sacred gift feels empowering. Recognizing that you became hypervigilant to emotional signals because your childhood required it for survival feels devastating. But Jung insisted that only the second recognition leads to actual empowerment, because you can't master an ability you don't fully understand. And you can't fully understand an empathic ability if you refuse to look at what created it. There's another layer to this hidden truth that Jung documented extensively, and it involves what empathic abilities actually cost when they operate unconsciously. Most empaths believe their suffering comes from the world being too harsh, or other people being too draining. Jung saw it differently. He observed that the greatest damage to empaths came not from external sources, but from the way their own abilities turned inward against them. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. When an empath perceives others' emotional states without conscious processing, something insidious happens. The boundary between self and other dissolves so completely that the empath loses access to their own authentic emotional reality. They become so flooded with everyone else's psychological material that they can no longer identify what they actually feel about anything. Ask a raw empath how they feel, and they'll often go blank. Not because they don't feel, because they're feeling so many things from so many sources that locating their own signal in the noise has become impossible. Jung called this identity dissolution through empathic merger. The empath's sense of self becomes so entangled with perceived emotional data from others that their own psychological identity grows thin. They don't know what they want because they're too busy sensing what everyone else wants. They don't know what they feel because they're overwhelmed by what everyone around them feels. They don't know who they are because they have spent their entire life being a mirror for other people's psychological states. This dissolution explains something empaths rarely talk about, but almost universally experience: the strange emptiness that descends when they're finally alone. You'd think solitude would bring relief. Instead, it often brings a terrifying vacancy. Because when all the external emotional signals stop, the empath discovers they don't know who they are without them. Their identity was built on receiving and processing other people's material. Remove the material, and the structure collapses. Jung recognized this as one of the most painful aspects of empathic experience. The ability that makes you extraordinarily attuned to others simultaneously prevents you from developing a solid relationship with yourself. You know everyone else intimately while remaining a stranger to your own psyche. And every spiritual teaching that celebrates your sensitivity without addressing this internal void is actually reinforcing the pattern that's destroying you. The path forward in Jung's framework involved a process he called reclamation, not shutting down empathic abilities, not building walls, not pretending you don't perceive what you perceive. Reclamation meant systematically rebuilding a relationship with your own inner world that had been neglected or abandoned in favor of monitoring everyone else's. This process started with what Jung described as emotional archaeology. The empath had to dig beneath the accumulated layers of other people's feelings to excavate their own. What do I actually feel right now? If I set aside what I'm sensing from the people around me, what do I actually want, separate from what I perceive others wanting from me? What do I actually believe, independent of the emotional convictions I've absorbed from my environment? These questions sound simple. For empaths, they're among the hardest questions in existence because their psychological operating system was never designed to prioritize their own answers. Jung would guide patients through extended periods of reduced social contact, not as avoidance, but as excavation. Without the constant influx of others' emotional material, the empath could begin to hear their own signal, faint at first, sometimes barely distinguishable from the echo of absorbed feelings, but present, real, authentically theirs. And as they learn to identify this signal, to strengthen it, to trust it, something remarkable happened to their empathic abilities. The abilities didn't diminish, they became precise. Instead of absorbing everything indiscriminately, the empath could now perceive selectively because they had a stable internal reference point. They knew what was theirs and what wasn't, because they'd done the work of establishing what theirs actually felt like. The emotional archaeology gave them an anchor, and an anchored empath perceives with clarity that an unanchored empath never achieves. Jung also documented a transformation in how empaths related to the information their abilities provided. Before reclamation, empathic perception triggered compulsive action. You sense someone's pain, you rush to fix it. You detect someone's dishonesty, you confront it or spiral about it. You perceive a room full of tension. You either try to dissolve it or flee from it. The perception and the response were fused together, leaving no space for conscious choice. After reclamation, a gap opened between perception and response. The empath could sense someone's pain and simply hold that awareness without being compelled to act on it. They could detect dishonesty and choose strategically whether to address it or simply file the information for their own protection. They could perceive tension and remain present within it without needing to manage it. This gap, this tiny space between seeing and reacting, was where the empath's genuine power lived, not in the seeing itself, in the freedom to choose what to do with what they saw. Jung described this as the difference between being a channel and being a vessel. A channel has no walls. Everything flows through it indiscriminately, and the channel has no say in what passes. A vessel has structure. It can receive, hold, examine, and pour selectively. The channel is at the mercy of whatever flows through it. The vessel is in relationship with what it contains. Empaths operating as channels are overwhelmed and powerless. Empaths operating as vessels are perceptive and sovereign. This transformation also changed how empaths experience their sensitivity socially. Before reclamation, empaths tended to attract people who unconsciously recognized someone willing to absorb their unprocessed emotional material. The empath became a dumping ground for others' unexamined pain, not because these people were necessarily malicious, but because the empath's open channel created an irresistible psychological vacuum. Unprocessed emotion flows toward the nearest available receptor, and the unanchored empath was always available. After reclamation, this dynamic shifted dramatically. The empath's selective perception meant they were no longer unconsciously broadcasting availability for emotional absorption. People who had been drawn to the empath's open channel found themselves strangely unable to unload in the same way. Not because the empath had become cold or distant, but because the unconscious invitation had been withdrawn. The empath was still compassionate, still perceptive, still capable of deep connection, but they were connecting from sovereignty rather than from merger, and that sovereignty fundamentally changed who could access them and how. Jung observed that this shift often triggered intense reactions from people in the empath's existing relationships. Partners, family members, friends who had unconsciously relied on the empath's absorptive capacity experienced the change as rejection or abandonment. The empath hadn't stopped caring. They'd stopped hemorrhaging. But to people accustomed to unrestricted access to the empath's emotional processing capacity, the distinction was invisible. All they knew was that the empath was no longer functioning the way they used to, and it felt like loss. Jung warned empaths that this phase was where most of them abandoned the reclamation process. The social pressure to revert to the old pattern was enormous. People they loved were in distress. Their own guilt about abandoning others by claiming their own psychological territory was crushing. And the familiar identity of the selfless, absorptive empath was so deeply established that stepping out of it felt like stepping into nothingness. Who am I if I'm not the one who feels everything for everyone? The answer, Jung discovered through years of clinical observation, was that you become yourself, not the self constructed from other people's emotional material, not the identity built on your willingness to absorb. Your actual self, the one that existed before the survival adaptation took over, the one that's been buried beneath decades of other people's feelings. That self has preferences you've never explored, boundaries you've never set, desires you've never acknowledged, and a relationship with your own emotional life that you've never had the space to develop. Jung called this the empath's individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole by integrating the ability with a fully developed sense of self. It wasn't about choosing between sensitivity and strength. It was about discovering that real sensitivity requires strength, that genuine perception requires a stable perceiver, and that the most powerful empathic ability is one grounded in a person who knows exactly who they are. The hidden truth behind empaths' spiritual abilities isn't that the abilities are false, they're real. It isn't that they're purely spiritual in origin. They're psychological adaptations that access genuine dimensions of human perception. And it isn't that they're simply gifts to be celebrated or curses to be endured. They're capacities that exist in raw form until the empath does the work of understanding their origin, reclaiming their own identity, and learning to perceive with sovereignty rather than survival desperation. Jung would tell you that your ability to sense what others feel, to perceive what's hidden, to know what hasn't been spoken is extraordinary. But he would also tell you that this ability, left unexamined and unintegrated, will consume you. It will erase your identity while making you feel deeply connected to everyone. It will exhaust your nervous system while making you feel spiritually alive. It will attract exactly the people who will exploit it while making you feel needed and purposeful. The ability is real. The way you've been using it is the lie. The truth is that empathic abilities were never meant to operate at the expense of the person carrying them. They were never meant to replace your own emotional life with everyone else's. They were never meant to position you as the designated absorber of pain for every person in your orbit. They were meant to give you extraordinarily accurate information about your environment so you could navigate it wisely, connect with others authentically, and protect yourself from dynamics that would harm you. When you understand this, when you truly grasp that your abilities exist to serve your life rather than to sacrifice it, everything shifts. The perception remains. The sensitivity stays intact. But you're no longer bleeding out through an open wound you mistook for a spiritual gift. You're seeing clearly through eyes that finally belong to you. And that clarity, that grounded, sovereign, self-possessed perception, is what Jung spent decades trying to help empaths access. Not because it made them less sensitive, because it made them genuinely powerful for the first time in their lives. If you haven't yet, Check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.